Hey everybody, Quinn here. You're probably wondering why I have this book here, and that's because I want to be more experimental with my videos as of recently. Since I like historical figures and I've recently done a Martin Luther King drawing last month, which you should see in my community post, I thought I'd do my first read aloud video of another historical figure. Today I'll be reading about Who is Amelia Earhart by Kate Bohm Jerome. So without further ado, let's read this book. Here's Amelia Earhart. We're over here. I'm gonna go turn the page. Who was Amelia Earhart? By Kate Bohm Jerome. Illustrated by David Kane. Who was Amelia Earhart? Amelia Earhart was a pioneer. This doesn't mean she traveled west in a covered wagon or lived in a log cabin. It means she had a special spirit. She liked to be the first to do new things. In the 1920s, Amelia became a pilot. This was a time when the airplane was still a new invention. Not many people knew how to fly one. It was even more unusual for a woman to fly planes. Amelia set many flying records to prove that she was the best. Amelia helped start the airline business in the United States. She was also a writer, a speaker, and a fashion designer. But it all started from her love of flying. Amelia was a pioneer in another way, too. She thought that women deserved to have the same rights as men did. This was at a time when women were fighting for the rights to vote. Many people still thought women were not strong enough or smart enough to have jobs outside the house. But Amelia's actions proved that bravery and brains were not for males only. Unfortunately, Amelia didn't live to see old age. Just before her 40th birthday, she tried to set a new record. 40th, sorry. Unfortunately, Amelia did not live to see old age. Just before her 40th birthday, she tried to set a new record. She wanted to be the first woman to fly all the way around the world, but Amelia and her plane went down somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. I think when they mean that, they mean the Bermuda Triangle. She was never seen again. Most people remember Amelia Earhart for the last event of her life, but this is a story about everything that came first. Here's how it actually all began. Chapter 1. Young Amelia. Amelia Mary Earhart was born in her grandmother's house in Atchison, Kansas on July 24th, 1897. The house was high on a hill. It had 11 rooms. Maids and a cook worked there. Dinner was served on very fine china. There's the house, right over there on the bottom. Amelia's mother's parents had a lot of money, but Amelia's father had trouble keeping a job. Edwin Earhart could barely make the payments on the family house in Kansas City. There were always money worries, but Amelia loved her parents, especially her handsome, funny father. When Amelia was 7, her father had enough money to take the family to see the World's Fair in St. Louis, Missouri. 20 million people came to the 1904 World's Fair. 45 countries set up exhibits. And here's the World's Fair. The World's Fair had been popular events throughout the history of the United States. In 1876, a Centennial Exposition was held in Philadelphia. It marked the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. 10 years in the making, this World's Fair introduced people to many new things. One of the most popular exhibits showed a new machine called the typewriter. In 1893, a fair called the World Columbia Exposition was held in Chicago. It was a grand event. One area at this fair was called the Midway Plaisance. The Midway featured popular entertainment. Here, the first Ferris wheel was introduced. It's a 260 feet tall and had 36 cars. It could hold more than 2,000 people when it was full. Building the World of Tomorrow was the motto of the World's Fair, held in New York City in 1939. A popular exhibit at this fair was the Futurama. Huh. Hey, just like the Magroning show, Futurama. Visitors sat in moving chairs to get a glimpse of the city in the future. Modern buildings and huge highway systems wowed people of all ages. Another exhibit also got a lot of attention. Here, people stared at a new invention called the television. Many wondered what good it might be in the future. And here's a picture of the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. Let's continue reading. Oh, sorry about that. At the St. Louis Fair, there were Eskimo villages and Japanese gardens. Each nation and state showed something about its own culture. Amelia and her younger sister, Muriel, saw a big roller coaster at the fair. When she got back to Kansas City, Amelia tried to build one in her fair. Muriel, Amelia's uncle, and another friend helped. Wooden tracks ran from the top of a shed to the yard below. A little buggy rolled down the tracks. The tracks were greased with fat to make the buggy go faster. Although always the bravest kid on the block, Amelia was the first to try out the roller coaster. She dragged the buggy up to the top of the tracks and got on. Her sister held her feet. When Amelia gave the signal, Muriel let go. Amelia went down head first and crashed. Did that stop Amelia? Not at all. She and her friends made the slope of the tracks less steep. Then she got on the buggy again. This time she made a good run. She loved the speed, and it was almost as if she were flying through the air. On a cold day in December, Amelia went sledding with her sister. Amelia wanted to go very fast. She took a running start. Then she jumped on the sled, lying head first on her stomach. The hill was icy. Amelia was gaining speed. Suddenly there was trouble below. A horse-drawn wagon came out from the side street. It was directly Amelia's path. Amelia couldn't stop. At the last second, Amelia ducked. She and her sled slid right under the horse. A moment later, Amelia was up and smiling. Her quick thinking had helped her avoid a bad accident. In the summer before 8th grade, Amelia went to another fair, the Iowa State Fair. Here, Amelia saw her first airplane. And here's other people who invented flight as well. Orville and Wilbur Wright. Orville and Wilbur Wright never went to college, but they were good at building things. On December 17, 1903, in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, they made history. That was the day their airplane, the Wright Flyer, went 100 feet in the air. The Flyer was a rickety plane by today's standards. Its body was made of cloth stretched over a wood frame. It had one small engine and two propellers. Many thought it would crash on takeoff, but it didn't. The Flyer stayed in the air for 12 seconds, a short trip indeed, but this first flight changed history forever. It was 1909, only 6 years after Wilbur and Orville Wright had made their famous flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Surprisingly, Amelia didn't think too much of the airplane. She was always adventurous, but her love of flying came much later. Amelia's teenage years were hard. Her father couldn't keep a job, and the family began to split up. Amelia's mother took the girls to Chicago, and they lived in a rooming house, and Amelia went to Hyde Park High School. Amelia was a good student. She dreamed of going to a first-rate college. But unfortunately, there wasn't enough money, and however, Amelia's mother was able to send her to a good private school for girls. It was time for Amelia to start out on her own. Chapter 2. A Woman of Character. In the fall of 1916, when Amelia was 19 years old, she boarded a train for the Organs School in Pennsylvania. Amelia didn't mind going far away from home. She was starting on a new adventure on her own. The head of the Organs School was a woman named Miss Sutherland. At first, Amelia didn't like her, but in time she changed her mind. Miss Sutherland was strict but very smart. She had opinions on all sorts of subjects, and although Miss Sutherland had many chances to marry, she never did. Miss Sutherland was more interested in her career than a husband. Miss Sutherland was an independent woman who made a big impression on her pupils. The other students and teachers at Organs admired Amelia. She was shy but charming. She was a good athlete. She was also a practical girl. In a letter home to her mother, Amelia wrote, "I don't need spring clothes, so don't worry about sending me money. I know you all need things more than I." Once Amelia even bought hand-me-down shoes from a friend. In her second year, Amelia was elected vice president of her class. Amelia wrote the class motto. She strongly believed in what it said. Honor is the foundation of courage. While Amelia was at Organs, the United States entered the First World War. During the Christmas holidays of 1917, Amelia went to Toronto, Canada. Her sister Muriel was in school there. Amelia's mother also joined them. In Toronto, Amelia saw soldiers who had been wounded in the war. Amelia wanted to help. Within a week, she made a decision. She wasn't going back to Organs. Instead, she was staying in Toronto. Amelia would train to be a nurse's aide and work in a hospital. People who knew Amelia weren't surprised. Amelia always had to know what she believed in. And here is World War I. It was called the Great War, but it was really terrible in reality. More than 30 million people were wounded or died in World War I between the years of 1914 and 1918. At the beginning, only Germany and Austria-Hungary were fighting against the Allied forces of Britain, France, and Russia. As the war dragged on, more countries got involved. The United States joined the Allies, entering the war in April 1917. By the summer of 1918, around 200,000 American soldiers were being sent to Europe each month. These soldiers often lived in deep ditches. They dug these trenches for protection as they fought. They were called trench warfare. Peace finally came with an Allied victory in November of 1918. Most people thought there could never be another war like this. Unfortunately, though, they were wrong. Only 20 years later, the world exploded into World War II. Alright. Chapter 3. Amelia chooses a career. Amelia worked in a Toronto hospital until World War I was over. Then she came back to the United States. She wanted to study science. Maybe she would become a doctor. Amelia decided to enroll at Columbia University in New York City. At that time, most men wanted wives who would stay at home. That was fine with most women, but not Amelia. She couldn't understand why women had to give up work just because of a wedding ring. And we interrupt this reading to read more about the women's suffrage movement. Sounds painful, doesn't it? But the word suffrage doesn't mean suffering. It's about getting the right to vote. It wasn't until the 1890s that Wyoming became the first state to let women vote. By 1913, when Amelia Earhart was a high school student, women could vote in only 12 of 48 states, but the voices of protest were getting louder. Suffragettes marched into streets. Many were arrested and put in jail. But the fight continued. Finally, on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was passed. Women in every state of the Union had won the right to vote. Amelia wanted a career, but she just couldn't decide what career she wanted. After some time at Columbia, Amelia quit school again. She went to Los Angeles. Amelia's parents were back together again, and she moved in with them. Amelia's family was hoping Amelia would settle down soon. Amelia was seeing a young man named Sam Chapman. Sam asked Amelia to marry him, but Amelia knew that Sam would not want her to have a career. She said no. Amelia knew that she didn't want. Still, she was drifting. Then on Christmas Day 1920, her life changed. 23-year-old Amelia Earhart and her father were with a crowd of people in Long Beach, California. They were all looking up in the sky. Why? Well, up here, there's why. Because an air show was taking place. Pilots raced each other in their planes. They also did incredible tricks like wing walking. Amelia was fascinated. She had just one question, though. How much would it cost to take flying lessons? At that time, there were no airports or runways. Planes took off from big empty fields. 3 days later, Amelia and her dad went to Rogers Field. It was there that she took her first plane ride. The flight was 10 minutes long, and the pilot sat in front. Amelia sat behind him. The cockpit was completely open. Amelia and the pilot wore goggles to protect their eyes. The plane bounced across the bumpy field for takeoff. Then it slowly rose into the air. Right away, Amelia was hooked. She later said, "As soon as we left the ground, I knew I myself had to fly." Amelia was not drifting any longer. From that day on, she had a goal. Amelia was going to become a pilot. And nearby Kenner Airfield, a woman named Netta Snook gave flying lessons. A woman pilot. This was just what Amelia wanted. Netta agreed to teach Amelia to fly. It would cost $1 a minute. In 1921, that was a lot of money. But Amelia was willing to pay. The next day, Amelia arrived for her first flying lesson in riding pants, boots, and a jacket. She walked 3 miles from the streetcar to the airfield, but she wasn't tired. She was excited that her dream was about to come true. That first day, Amelia only taxied the plane on the ground, but it wasn't long before she was up in the air. Amelia was a good student. She just seemed to know naturally what to do. Netta and Amelia became good friends. At 24, Netta was only 1 year older than Amelia. Amelia wanted to learn all about airplanes. She pestered Netta with questions all the time. When the weather was good, Amelia practiced flying. When the weather was bad, Amelia didn't waste that time. She read and studied about flying. Amelia also learned to repair airplanes. She cut her long hair short and she bought a leather jacket. The jacket was soon wrinkled and oil stained. Amelia didn't care. Learning about airplanes kept her busy all the time. Soon Amelia wanted her own plane. With her mother's help, Amelia bought a small one at Kinner Airfield. Netta thought the plane was too small to be safe. Amelia ignored her. She had her plane painted yellow and she named it the Canary. On December 15, 1921, Amelia took the test for her license. It was a little less than 1 year from when she took her first lesson, but she passed. Amelia Earhart was now an airplane pilot. Chapter 4. Amelia takes off. With her pilot's license in hand, Amelia flew in some air shows. Most pilots were men, so a young woman attracted a lot of attention. Amelia didn't like to be on display, but she worked in the shows to earn money. She had to keep on flying, though. Then Amelia's friend and teacher Netta Schnook got married. Just as Amelia feared, her friend's flying days were over. Netta would now be a wife and mother, so Amelia needed another instructor. She teamed up with an expert named Monte Tijo. Monte had flown in the army, and he also did stunt work flying in the movies. Monte taught Amelia a lot. She even learned to do tricks in the air like huge upside-down loops. There we go. Now she felt like trying for a flying record. Amelia wanted to see how high she could go. Amelia didn't tell anyone her plans. She had an instrument put in her plane. It measured how high above ground the plane was. In the early 1920s, planes didn't fly as high as they do today. One reason was because the cockpits were open. At high altitudes, there was not much oxygen to breathe. Amelia knew she could pass out if she went too high, but she was willing to risk it, though. It took 2 attempts. Amelia flew through fog and sleet. She finally made it to 14,000 feet, more than 2.5 miles high. Then her plane's engine began to fail. Amelia brought her plane down fast, and she was just barely able to make a safe landing, but she had her record. Although Amelia loved to fly, she soon found out that she couldn't support herself just by flying. There were no big airlines or airplanes yet. People didn't travel by plane. In fact, most people never expected to take a ride on a plane. In 1924, Amelia temporarily gave up on her dream. She sold the Canary and used the money to buy a car. You might guess Amelia would pick up a practical automobile like the Ford Model T. She didn't, though. She bought a fancy yellow convertible. If she didn't fly in the air, she would at least have the feeling of flying across the ground. Amelia named her car the Yellow Peril. She and her mother drove across country and headed for the East Coast. Amelia went back to Columbia University, but again, it wasn't for long. She had to drop out again, as usual. The problem was money. Sam Chapman followed Amelia out west. He proposed marriage again. It was tempting. Amelia was now 20 years old. Most people thought women this age were already old maids. If Amelia married Sam, she wouldn't have to worry so much about money. However, Sam would want her to stay at home and have children. Amelia had to decide. To her, the choice was very clear. Amelia told her sister Muriel of her decision. I don't want to marry him, Amelia said. I don't want to marry anyone. Amelia couldn't stand the thought of giving up her freedom. The next job Amelia found was in Boston. She worked at Dennison House, where she took good care of poor children. Amelia really liked the job. She knew she was doing something worthwhile. Flying was now limited to weekends, but she watched other pilots with interest. In 1927, a man named Charles Lindbergh made news all over the world. He was the first pilot to fly alone across the Atlantic Ocean. It took him more than 33 hours to fly from Long Island, New York to Paris. A woman from London named Amy Guess wanted to be the first woman to fly across the Atlantic. Guess wasn't a pilot, so she would set the record just by being a passenger in the plane. George Putnam, a book publisher in New York, was going to oversee her attempt. However, Amy's family wouldn't let her go, so George Putnam had to find another woman, and this time, he wanted a pilot. Here's Charles Lindbergh, aviation hero. Charles Lindbergh started out as a barnstormer. That's what pilots who did daring tricks at early air shows in the 1920s were called. But on May 21st, 1927, Charles left his tricks behind and entered the record books. No one had ever made a solo trip across the Atlantic before. It was very dangerous. His plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, was only 28 feet long. Lindbergh's biggest problem was staying awake, so he'd stick his head out of the plane's window for blasts of cold air. He also kept reminding himself that if he slept, he would surely die. Putnam ran a big publishing company, so he knew a lot of people. He was good at making deals. Putnam asked a friend to find the right woman for the trip. The friend found was Amelia Earhart. Chapter 5. Amelia becomes a hero. Amelia met with both George Putnam and Amy Guest in New York. They both thought that she was perfect for the job. Attractive, polite, well-educated, she got the job. The job was actually not nearly as good as it sounded. Amelia wouldn't get paid. A man named Wilmer Stoltz would fly the plane. He'd get $20,000. Although Amelia was called the captain, she was really actually just the passenger in reality. Why did Amelia agree? First, no woman had ever crossed the Atlantic by plane before. Experience alone was enough to make Amelia go. Amelia summed up her feelings in a letter to a friend. When a great adventure's offered you, you don't refuse it, that's all. Amelia also hoped that if the trip were successful, all the attention could bring her other flying jobs. The flight was very dangerous. Charles Lindbergh had made the trip safely, but 14 other people had died trying to cross the ocean. 3 had been women. Still, 2 other women pilots were already planning to try it. Amelia had to move quickly if she wanted to be the first. The plane, called the Friendship, took off from Boston on June 3rd, 1928. However, the crew had to land in Canada because of bad weather. Many days went by. The Friendship was still unable to take off. Amelia discovered another problem. Her pilot, Wilmer Stoltz, drank too much. If Wilmer got drunk, she knew he couldn't fly the plane. But if they didn't take off soon, Amelia would lose the record. It was now or never. On June 16th, Amelia made a decision. She told Wilmer to get ready to fly. They were leaving the next day no matter what. On the morning of June 17th, Amelia sent a cable to George Putnam back in Boston. The cable read, "Violet, cheerio, A.E." Violet was a code word. It meant that the Friendship was taking off. For the long flight, Wilmer Stoltz and his co-pilot Slim Gordon took turns flying the plane. Amelia wrote notes in her journal. After 20 hours of flying, they knew they were low on fuel. Could they find land in time? The answer was yes. And here's the route of the Friendship. And all the way here in Boston, all the way to Port, South Wales, and London. Fortunately, the Friendship did land down in Port, South Wales, 20 hours and 40 minutes after taking off the Canadian coast. They've actually done it. On June 18, 1928, Amelia Earhart became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. What came next was a big surprise for Amelia. The trip made her an instant hero. Amelia hadn't flown the plane, but people still thought she was very brave. In London, Amelia was entertained by the rich and famous, and she had tea with royalty. On her return to America, Amelia was met with even greater excitement. There were parades and speeches, crowds of people wanted to see and hear the brave female. Many people compared Amelia Earhart to the famous pilot Charles Lindbergh. They thought that Amelia, who was tall and slim, even looked like Lindbergh. Amelia's nickname became Lady Lindy. George Putnam liked this a lot. He knew he could make Amelia even more famous. All the attention was hard on Amelia. Sometimes she was frightened by the push of people trying to get near her. However, Amelia was a smart woman. She knew she would have to be in the spotlight if she wanted to fly planes and break records. Amelia also knew that if people got excited about flying, then the tiny airline business would grow. Amelia hoped to be a part of that business. If Amelia made speeches, she would also be paid. That meant that she could paid to buy another airplane. With her own plane, she could set more records. That would lead to more speeches and more money. For the first time in her life, Amelia started to believe that she could actually make a living by flying. George Putnam became Amelia's manager. He set up lots of public appearances for her. In 6 months, Amelia made over 100 speeches and gave more than 200 interviews. Amelia didn't complain about her busy schedule. She was given a new car for an appearance at an auto show. She also made money by letting companies use her name to advertise their products. The fur-lined leather Amelia Earhart flying suit became very popular in a New York department store. Amelia also became an editor for Cosmopolitan magazine and wrote a column about aviation. Amelia didn't really like to write, but the articles brought more publicity. Many of the magazine's readers thought that Amelia was a good role model for young girls. By 1929, Amelia was the best-known female pilot in America. But what Amelia really wanted was more time flying. So a week before she turned 32, Amelia purchased a second-hand Lockheed Vega. It was a big plane that was hard to handle, but was built for speed and distance. As soon as possible, Amelia wanted to set more records. The first women's cross-country air race was going to be held later that summer. It was called the Women's Air Derby. Whoever flew from Santa Monica, California to Cleveland, Ohio in the shortest time would win. Amelia was eager to enter. The course, which went over the Rocky Mountains, was very dangerous. The Rules Committee considered changing the flight path for making a male navigator go along in every single plane. Needless to say, though, Amelia was very angry. She and other women pilots had flown many hours alone. Amelia said she wouldn't enter the race as she couldn't fly on her own. Because of Amelia and several other female pilots, the committee backed down. The women would fly the whole course by themselves. On August 18, 1929, 20,000 people turned up in Santa Monica, California, for the start of the race. And here's Amelia's plane right over there. Many people didn't take the woman seriously. Will Rogers, a famous writer at the time, called the race the Powder Puff Derby. Still, by that Sunday afternoon, all 19 planes were in the air and racing against the clock. The race was to take 8 days. But there were problems from the very start. Planes broke down. Landing fields weren't in good shape. On the second day, Amelia's plane flipped over on landing. She wasn't hurt, and she was able to fix her plane and kept racing. But others weren't so lucky. Some planes went off course and crashed. One pilot died in the mountains of Arizona. On August 25th, the race was over. Only 11 of the 19 women finished. Amelia Earhart came in third, even though she didn't win. Amelia learned a lot. She also got to know many of the best women pilots in the country. After the race, many women pilots decided it was time to start their own group. On November 2nd, 1929, 26 women met in an airplane hangar in Long Island, New York. They wondered what to call themselves. Amelia suggested they name the club after the number of women who first joined. The other pilots liked that idea. Over the next several months, the name changed from the 86s to the 97s. Finally, the 99s was the name that stuck. Amelia worked to get more women pilots to join. By the following summer, the 99s had almost 200 members. The group helped women pilots get jobs. The 99s also had an office where careful records of women's aviation achievements could be kept. Amelia Earhart was elected the first president of that group. Sometimes Amelia felt she didn't deserve all the praise that the public gave her, but she had truly earned the respect of the other women flyers, and it meant a lot to her. Chapter 6. Amelia the Businesswoman. In the fall of 1929, the stock market crashed. Many people lost a lot of money. Many also lost their jobs. It was the start of the Great Depression. Amelia worried about her parents who had split up again. Her mother was living with Amelia's sister and husband. Amelia helped out by giving her mother some money every single month. Her father was also ill, so Amelia bought the log cabin in Los Angeles where he was living. Amelia felt a strong sense of duty to her parents. And here's all about the Great Depression. It started on October 29th, 1929. That was the day a lot of people lost a lot of money on the stock market. Since they had less money, people couldn't buy things. Businesses had to close and millions of people lost their jobs. Soup kitchens were set up to feed people. The hungry waited for hours in long lines, hoping to get a little free food. The Great Depression dragged on for years. Mother Nature made things even worse. There was very little rain in the Great Plains during the 1930s. Farmland turned to dust and more families became homeless. Under President Franklin Roosevelt, the government formed a plan to make things better. It was called the New Deal. Jobs were created, people began to make money again, and by the end of the decade, the worst was over, but people who lived through the Great Depression will never forget the hard times. Amelia had to keep earning money, but that wasn't easy during the Depression. She still gave speeches, but she had another job, too. Amelia helped start an airline on the East Coast. It was called the New York, Philadelphia, and Washington Airway because it flew between those cities. Amelia's job was to convince people to fly on the airline. It was difficult to run an airline in the early days. Only a few cities had airports. Once free planes arrived in Philadelphia at the same time. Some passengers had to change planes. Some people just got off to stretch their legs. But airline workers got confused. They put people on the wrong planes. Some were accidentally flown back to the city they had just left. Another problem on the early flights was air sickness. It wasn't just the bumps. Fumes from the engines often came into the cabin. There also was no air conditioning. Sometimes more than half of the passengers on the plane threw up. Still more than 1,500 passengers flew on the tiny airline during the first 10 days. Amelia was happy to report that almost half the tickets had been sold to women. Besides working with the airline and taking care of her family, Amelia was still trying to set records. That was part of being Amelia Earhart, the celebrity. In the summer of 1930, Amelia set 3 new speed records. The fastest speed she recorded was 180 miles per hour. Today, the average passenger jet flies at around 500 to 700 miles per hour. Much faster than Amelia had put. Here is the aviation industry. Today, traveling by plane seems as normal as taking a bus, but it wasn't always that way. In fact, your grandparents may not have stepped foot on an airplane until they were grown-ups. At first, airplanes primarily delivered mail, not people, but the many small companies that carried mail sometimes allow passengers to travel as well. By the late 1920s, these smaller companies combined to form 4 larger airlines: TWA, United, Eastern, and American. They were known as the Big Four and were the first to schedule passenger-only flights. In 1923, the first nonstop flight to travel across the country carried passengers from New York to San Diego. It would be another 30 years before a passenger jet traveled nonstop between New York and London. By mid-century, the airline industry in the US had truly taken off. Amelia was doing exactly what she had dreamed of doing. It was an exciting time, but then in September of 1930, Amelia received bad news. Her father had cancer. He wouldn't live much longer, and Amelia flew out to see him in California. She stayed with her father for 4 days. She took care of him and said her goodbyes. During her return trip to New York, she got word that her father had died. It was a very sad time for Amelia. She missed her father. She also was under a lot of pressure. She worked for an airline and she gave speeches all over the country. She raced her airplane and set records. She took care of her family, and Amelia was tired. She needed help. Amelia turned to her longtime manager, George Putnam. He was divorced now and wanted to marry Amelia. Amelia had said no many times, but maybe marriage to George Putnam could be very different. George was 10 years older than Amelia. He already had 2 grown children. George wouldn't expect Amelia to stay at home. In fact, he wanted to help her become even more famous. Amelia decided to take the risk. On February 7, 1931, she and George Putnam were married. Both bride and groom were in agreement on one important issue. Amelia would definitely keep her career. And although she didn't plan it, she even got to keep her name. Although she officially named Amelia Earhart Putnam after her marriage, the press didn't like the change. They soon dropped the Putnam and called her Amelia Earhart, just as they always had. Chapter 7: Pushing the Limits. By 1931, there were many changes in the world of flying. Slow wood-framed airplanes have been replaced with faster all-metal models. New planes have better instruments. Pilots could find their locations more easily and fly more safely. Newer planes were bigger and carried more passengers. Slowly, the public was won over to airplane travel. After all, though, it took only about 4 hours to go to Washington from New York by train. By plane, the trip was only 2.5 hours. In 1930, the first free flight attendants were hired by United Airlines. They were all nurses. They served meals and then took care of airsick passengers. There were also more than 450 licensed female pilots in the U.S. With more competition, it was getting more challenging to keep the public's interest. Amelia needed to do something different. She and George came up with a few ideas. Amelia started flying something called an autogyro. It was almost like a helicopter. Amelia became the first person to go across the country and back in an autogyro. But the autogyro was hard to fly. Many pilots thought it wasn't safe. Soon Amelia went back to a regular airplane. On one July morning in 1932, Amelia was having breakfast with her husband. She put down the paper she was reading and asked, "Would you mind if I flew the Atlantic alone?" No, George didn't mind at all. He wanted Amelia to become the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. May 20th, 1932 was the 5th anniversary of the Lindbergh flight. George Putnam thought that would be the perfect day for Amelia to take off. The press would love the connection. Amelia had new instruments, including 3 compasses, but in her plane. The weather over the Atlantic could be bad, and she would depend on the new technology to help her find her way. That new technology includes the thermometer, tachometer, altimeter, air pressure, stethoscope, oil pressure, and airspeed. On the day of her flight, Amelia told reporters she was sure of her success. But before she climbed into her plane, she quietly turned to a friend. "Do you think I can make it?" she asked. Even Amelia had her doubts. Amelia took off from Harbor Grace Airport in Newfoundland, Canada. Amelia didn't think the flight would be easy, and it wasn't. When she went too high, ice started to build in her planes, and the ice made the plane heavy. It might crash. So she took the plane down low. But when she went too close to the water, her instruments didn't even work. Without instruments, Amelia could get completely lost. The hours went by slowly. Amelia struggled to find just the right altitude. She sipped chicken soup. Gasoline dripped down the back of her neck from the extra fuel tank, and she struggled all night. But when the sun came up, Amelia spotted land. She set her airplane down in the cow pasture, frightening all the cows. She was in Ireland. She had done it. Amelia was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. Congratulations poured in. Amelia was 34 years old. She was smart, she was brave, and she was a great-looking woman. The public loved her. When she returned to New York City, there was a parade down Broadway. Thousands of people lined the streets to cheer for Amelia. The next day, Amelia flew to Washington, D.C., where President Herbert Hoover presented her with a medal. Amelia was as famous as movie stars of the day, but her fame didn't change her. She was still charming and somewhat shy. Even so, she liked that her opinions were now heard and respected. Amelia became more active in politics. She joined the National Woman's Party. Amelia thought women should be able to do the same things men did. For example, if a woman wanted to be a lawyer, then she should be able to do so. In a letter to the editor of a New York paper, Amelia stated her case. The right to earn a living belongs to all persons. Amelia certainly took that message to heart. Now that she was so famous, she found many different ways to make money. Amelia was already known as one of the best-dressed women in America, and this gave her husband an idea. George Putnam made some calls. Not long after, Macy's department store in New York made an announcement. A new line of women's clothing was going to be designed by Amelia Earhart. Amelia designed women's clothes for active living. Amelia believed that clothes should fit the way a woman lived. She liked fabrics that didn't wrinkle. She also liked clothes that were easy to wash and didn't need special care. Fashion designing took up a lot of her time. Amelia's photograph was in many magazines. She was also in demand, but flying was still Amelia's passion. Nothing else could match the adventure and challenge. A group of Hawaiian businessmen had an idea. They asked Amelia to become the first person to fly solo from Honolulu to California. It would be a 2,500-mile nonstop trip over the Pacific Ocean. On January 11, 1935, Amelia took off from Honolulu. 18 and a half hours later, she landed in Oakland, California. And she did it again. It was another one for the record books. Amelia always said she flew for the fun of it, but some people said she took too many risks. Others didn't like George. He was constantly trying to make money from Amelia's name and fame. Amelia was beginning to feel trapped. It was getting harder to set new records. Each time she had to fly farther and longer, setting records took money, and there was always new and better equipment to buy. However, there was one more flight she was determined to take, and it would be the biggest challenge yet. Chapter 8. The Final Flight. Amelia Earhart wanted to fly around the world. Although other pilots had circled the globe, she would fly close to the equator. This would make a longer and harder trip, 29,000 miles. A special plane was needed, a new Lockheed model called the Electra. The plane was large enough to carry 10 passengers, and Amelia had the seats removed. Extra fuel tanks were put in. This allowed the plane to fly up to 3,000 miles before stopping to refuel. The Electra had new radio equipment. Amelia would be able to communicate by voice and code. It also had 2 engines that made it more complicated to fly. Amelia had to train with different pilots to learn how to fly it. It would take months to prepare for the trip. Amelia and George hired 2 navigators to fly with Amelia. They would help Amelia stay on course. The flight path would go from east to west. Amelia would take off from California and head toward Hawaii. On March 17, 1937, the Electra left Oakland, California. Amelia and her 2 navigators arrived in Honolulu about 16 hours later. The first leg of the trip was a success. Then Amelia had an accident. As Amelia was taking off from Honolulu, the plane lurched out of control. The landing gear collapsed, a wing was torn open, and luckily no one was hurt. But the $100,000 plane was badly damaged and had to be shipped back to Lockheed on the mainland. Almost 2 months went by before the plane was ready to fly again. Because of the delay, one of the navigators couldn't continue the flight. That left only the other man, Fred Noonan. There was also another change. Due to weather patterns, the flight path had to be reversed. Amelia would now fly from west to east. On May 21st, Amelia left Oakland, California, and headed east to Miami, Florida. The whole world was watching. The trip started off well. From Miami, Amelia flew to Puerto Rico, and she flew along the east coast of South America to Venezuela, then on to Suriname and Brazil. The Electra was holding up well, but there wasn't much room to move around. Amelia communicated with Fred Noonan by passing notes on a fishing pole. It was better than climbing over the extra fuel tanks. Amelia flew over 40 hours and 4,000 miles in the first week. And that was just the beginning. She flew over the Atlantic and crossed Africa. Within 3 weeks, she had flown at about 20,000 miles in 1 to 35 hours. Amelia was getting tired. She would be glad when the long hours of flying were over. By July 1st, Amelia had reached New Guinea. From New Guinea, she'd go to Howland Island and to Honolulu, Hawaii. The next and last stop would be Oakland, California. There were only about 7,000 miles left in the 29,000-mile trip. Most of these last miles were over the Pacific Ocean. On July 2nd, Amelia took off for New Guinea. The trip to Howland was to take about 19 hours. Howland was a tiny island in the Pacific. It was only 2 miles long and 3/4 of a mile wide. It would be very challenging to find, but it was the only place to land and refuel. Amelia had to depend on Fred Noonan to spot the tiny strip of sand. To help Amelia and Fred, a U.S. Coast Guard ship was sent to Howland. The ship would be waiting at the island. It would send out a signal to guide the Electra in for landing. On July 2nd, Amelia took off for New Guinea. She had radio contact with New Guinea for the next 7 hours, but then she went out of range. Amelia was supposed to reach Howland Island early the next morning. Throughout the night, the radio men on the Coast Guard ship heard short messages from Amelia, but they couldn't tell how far out she was. The captain was very worried. Amelia didn't seem to hear the radio messages, and they couldn't get a fix on her when she called in to them. At 7:42 a.m., the radio man on the Coast Guard ship got a brief message. Amelia said, "We must be on you, but can't see you, and gas is running low. We're unable to reach you by radio." Again, the Coast Guard tried to respond. However, it seemed that Amelia couldn't still hear him. They tried to locate her plane, but her messages weren't long enough to do it. At 8:45 a.m., one more message came in from Amelia. The last thing she said was, "We are running north and south." Amelia was frantically searching for Howland Island, but she never found it. Right away, a rescue mission was begun. More than 4,000 men on 10 ships searched the Pacific. Another 65 airplanes flew in to help search for Amelia and Fred. So what happened? Did Amelia's plane crash into the Pacific Ocean? Or was she able to land on some remote island? Neither Fred Noonan nor Amelia Earhart were ever found or heard from again. The mystery captured the public's imagination. For years after the plane's disappearance, news stories would pop up. Some said Amelia was a prisoner of war. Others said she was alive and well, living on a remote island, but no story was ever proven true. Even today, people are still looking for Amelia's plane. An underwater robot submarine has scoured the Pacific Ocean floor where the Electra may have gone down. Search parties still occasionally hike through remote Pacific islands near Howland, hoping to find a clue in the overgrown jungles. Who knows? Someday the remains of Amelia's plane may be found. Whether that happens or not, it doesn't change what Amelia Earhart did in her lifetime. She didn't just fly planes. She didn't just broke records. She opened doors for women all over the world. She was a pioneer who said, "You can do anything you decide to." And here's the timeline of Amelia's life, and the timeline of the world. And that, my friends, is the end of this read aloud of Who Was Amelia Earhart. If you guys like this video, please make sure to hit like and subscribe if you want to see more read alouds like this, and I hope you guys have an amazing day. Bye-bye.